The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine forests and pristine snow as morning sunlight bathed the Everest Grand Resort in a golden glow. Perched high in the majestic Rockies, this exclusive retreat stood like a crown jewel against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, offering sanctuary to those seeking both luxury and solitude. In the most opulent suite of the resort, Ethan Carter sat at his mahogany desk, his face familiar to readers of Fortune and Forbes magazines, though now marked with weariness. As CEO of Carter Financial Group, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment firms, he had grown accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions, but today his deep-set eyes reflected inner turmoil rather than their usual sharp focus. The past year had been particularly challenging, not because of market volatility or corporate mergers, but due to a highly publicized divorce that had dominated New York's social circles. The experience had left Ethan more guarded than ever, building walls around himself that seemed as impenetrable as the mountains surrounding the resort. In another wing of the resort, Lila Brooks moved quietly through her morning routine. At 24, with warm, honey-brown hair and striking green eyes, she carried herself with a grace that belied her humble beginnings. Having grown up in a small Colorado town, Lila had taken the job at the resort to save money for her true passion, interior design. Between tasks, she would often pause to sketch in her well-worn notebook, capturing ideas inspired by the resort's elegant spaces. Little did either of them know that fate had plans to intertwine their lives in ways neither could have imagined, starting with a chance encounter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and second chances. That morning, Lila was assigned to clean the Everest Grand Resort's most luxurious suite, the one where Ethan Carter was staying. She had worked at the resort for over a year and knew how to maintain a professional demeanor no matter the guest. With her cleaning supplies in hand, she approached the grand double doors of the suite, knocked lightly, and waited. When no response came, she assumed the room was empty and let herself in. The suite was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Rockies. Lila couldn't help but pause for a moment, admiring the way the sunlight illuminated the room's modern yet cozy design. She made a mental note of the color palette and the way the furniture complemented the natural light details she could use for her own design ideas someday. As she began tidying up, she heard the sound of a door opening behind her. Startled, she turned to see Ethan Carter emerging from the bedroom. His white dress shirt was partially unbuttoned, revealing a glimpse of his toned physique. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Lila. "Who are you?" Ethan's deep voice carried a mix of irritation and exhaustion. I'm sorry, sir," Lila stammered, quickly averting her gaze. "I'm the housekeeper. I thought the room was unoccupied." Ethan frowned slightly but said nothing more. Instead, he walked over to the sofa, picked up a newspaper, and began reading, as if her presence was of no consequence. Lila, though flustered, composed herself and continued her work, determined to remain professional. As she moved around the room, her eyes fell on a painting hanging slightly askew on the wall. Without thinking, she adjusted it, murmuring to herself, "This angle makes the space feel unbalanced." "What did you say?" Ethan's voice cut through the silence, making her jump. She turned to see him watching her, a hint of curiosity flickering in his otherwise cold expression. "Oh, it's nothing," Lila replied quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I just thought the painting should be aligned to complement the room's lines." Ethan raised an eyebrow, setting the newspaper aside. "You're interested in design?" Lila hesitated, unsure if she had overstepped, but there was something about his tone, less sharp, more intrigued, that encouraged her to answer honestly. "Yes, it's my dream. I want to be an interior designer someday." For the first time in what felt like years, Ethan allowed a faint smile to cross his face. "Interesting," he said, leaning back on the sofa. "Most people wouldn't notice something like that." Lila's eyes lit up as she spoke about her passion, her nervousness fading. "I've always loved how spaces can tell a story. The way a room is designed can make people feel comfortable, inspired, or even at peace. I want to create spaces like that." Ethan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was something refreshing about her honesty, her enthusiasm. It was a stark contrast to the calculated, superficial interactions he was used to in his world of high finance. "Well," he said finally, "this resort could use a fresh perspective. I've been considering redesigning a few areas. Perhaps you could help me with some ideas." Lila blinked, stunned by the suggestion. Me? I mean, I'm not a professional. I don't think I'm qualified." Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes the best ideas come from people who aren't bound by the rules. Think about it." Before she could respond, he stood and walked toward the bedroom, leaving her alone in the suite. Lila stood there for a moment, her heart racing. She couldn't tell if he was serious or just being polite, but the idea of contributing to a project like that thrilled her. As she finished cleaning and left the suite, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was the beginning of something unexpected. Ethan Carter, the enigmatic CEO, had seen something in her, the spark of potential she hadn't even realized she possessed. And though she didn't know it yet, this small moment would set the stage for a connection that would change both their lives forever. Over the next few days, Leela found herself working closely with Ethan on his idea to redesign parts of the resort. At first, their interactions were formal and professional. Ethan would ask for her thoughts on certain spaces, and Leela, though nervous, would offer her honest opinions. To her surprise, he seemed to genuinely value her input, often nodding thoughtfully or asking follow-up questions. One afternoon, as they stood in the resort's grand lobby, Lila pointed out how the heavy, dark furniture clashed with the natural light streaming in through the massive windows. If you replaced these with lighter, more modern pieces, it would make the space feel more open and inviting, she suggested, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I hadn't thought of that." Leela's cheeks flushed with pride. She wasn't used to being taken seriously, especially by someone as powerful as Ethan Carter, but as the days went on, she began to see a different side of him. Beneath his cold, businesslike exterior was a man who seemed genuinely interested in her ideas, and, to her surprise, their conversations gradually shifted from design to more personal topics. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the resort's lounge, Ethan asked, "What made you want to become a designer?" Lila hesitated, then smiled softly. "When I was a kid, my mom used to take me to antique shops. She loved finding old forgotten pieces and giving them new life. I think that's where it started. I've always believed that spaces and even objects can tell stories. I want to create places where people feel like they belong." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "That's a beautiful way to look at it," he said quietly. "Most people just see furniture and walls. You see something deeper." Lila looked at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "What about you?" she asked. "Why did you choose finance?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "I didn't choose it. It chose me. My father was a banker and he expected me to follow in his footsteps. I was good at it, so I did, but—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. "It's not exactly fulfilling." Lila tilted her head, studying him. "What would you do if you could do anything?" Ethan was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've spent so much of my life chasing success, I'm not sure I even know what I want anymore." There was a vulnerability in his voice that caught Lila off guard. She realized then that Ethan wasn't just a powerful CEO, he was a man carrying the weight of expectations, loneliness, and regret. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she wanted to help him find the answers he was searching for. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened. Ethan began seeking out Lila's company, not just for her design ideas, but for the quiet comfort she seemed to bring him. They would spend hours walking through the resort, discussing everything from color palettes to childhood memories. Lila found herself looking forward to these moments, even as she tried to remind herself that they came from two very different worlds. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan invited Lila to join him for dinner in the resort's private dining room. She hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate, but his gentle insistence won her over. The room was intimate, with soft candlelight and a view of the snow-covered mountains. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily, and for the first time, Lila saw Ethan truly relaxed. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "I haven't felt this at ease in a long time." Lila smiled, though her heart ached a little at the sadness in his voice. "Maybe you just needed a change of scenery," she said lightly. "Maybe," he agreed, his gaze lingering on her. "Or maybe it's something else." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. But before either of them could say anything more, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the spell. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "Work," he muttered, setting the phone aside. "It never stops." Lila nodded, though she couldn't help feeling a pang of disappointment. She knew better than to let herself get too close. Ethan Carter was a man with a life far removed from hers, and whatever connection they shared was bound to be temporary. But despite her efforts to keep her distance, Lila couldn't deny the growing feelings she had for him, and, though he didn't say it, Ethan felt the same. For the first time in years, he found himself opening up to someone, letting down the walls he had built around his heart. Lila's honesty, warmth, and quiet strength were like a balm to his weary soul. Neither of them knew where this would lead, but one thing was certain: their lives had already begun to change in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The snow fell softly outside the resort, blanketing the world in a serene, white silence. Inside, however, Lila's mind was anything but calm. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small plastic stick in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. Positive. Her heart raced as the reality of the situation sank in. She was pregnant, and not just with anyone's child, Ethan Carter's. The man who had unknowingly stolen her heart, the man whose life was so far removed from hers that she couldn't imagine how he would react to this news. Lila's first instinct was to tell him. Ethan deserved to know, but as she thought about it more, fear crept in. What if he thought she was trying to trap him? What if he accused her of using the pregnancy to secure a place in his life? She couldn't bear the thought of him looking at her with suspicion, or worse, resentment. So she made a decision. She would leave. It was the only way to protect herself and her unborn child from the complications that would inevitably come with Ethan's world. The next morning, Lila packed her things and left the resort without saying goodbye. She left a brief note for her manager, citing a family emergency as the reason for her sudden departure. As she boarded the bus that would take her back to her small hometown, she fought back tears, knowing she was leaving behind not just a job, but a man who had come to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. Ethan noticed her absence almost immediately. When he returned to the resort after a morning meeting and found her usual spot in the lobby empty, a strange sense of unease settled over him. He asked the staff about her, but all they could tell him was that she had left unexpectedly. At first, he tried to brush it off. She was just a housekeeper after all. But as the hours turned into days, he found himself unable to stop thinking about her. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about design, the way her laughter had a way of softening the edges of his otherwise cold, calculated world. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize his emotions, to keep his personal life separate from his work. But Lila had broken through those walls, and now that she was gone, he felt an emptiness he couldn't ignore. Determined to find her, Ethan used his resources to track her down. It didn't take long for him to discover that she had returned to her hometown, a small, unassuming place nestled in the Colorado foothills. Without hesitation, he booked a flight and made his way there, driven by a need he couldn't quite explain. Lila was in a small children's store browsing through baby clothes when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Lila." She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly she turned to see Ethan standing there, his tall frame and piercing blue eyes unmistakable. He looked out of place in the modest store, his tailored coat and polished shoes a stark contrast to the cozy, rustic surroundings. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his tone softer than she expected. "You disappeared without a word. I had to find you." Lila's eyes darted to the small rack of baby clothes she had been looking at, and she quickly stepped away, hoping he hadn't noticed. But it was too late. His gaze followed hers, and his expression shifted as realization dawned. "Lila," he said slowly, his voice laced with both shock and concern. "Are you—" She swallowed hard, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach. "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant." For a moment Ethan said nothing, his face unreadable. Lila braced herself for the worst, for anger, for accusations, for rejection. But when he finally spoke, his words took her by surprise. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with something she hadn't expected, hurt. "I didn't know how," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I was scared, Ethan. I didn't want you to think I was trying to take advantage of you." Ethan stepped closer, his expression softening. "Lila, I would never think that. You're not like that. You're different." She looked up at him, her tears spilling over. "I didn't want to complicate your life. You have so much going on, and I didn't think you'd want this." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to decide that for me. I want to be a part of this, of their lives. And yours." Lila's breath caught at his words. "Yes," he said firmly. "I don't know what this means for us, but I know I care about you, Lila, and I'm not going to walk away from this." For the first time in weeks, Lila felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. The news of Ethan and Lila's reunion and her pregnancy didn't stay private for long. Within days of Ethan's return to New York, whispers began circulating in the media. A high-profile CEO involved with a former housekeeper? It was the kind of story that tabloids couldn't resist. Headlines like "Wall Street Tycoon's Scandalous Love Affair" and "Ethan Carter's Secret Family" began to surface, accompanied by invasive photos of Ethan and Lila leaving a doctor's office together. For Lila, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She had always lived a quiet, private life, and now she found herself thrust into the spotlight in the most uncomfortable way. Strangers speculated about her motives, calling her a gold digger and accusing her of trapping Ethan for his wealth. Even in her small hometown, people began to whisper behind her back, their judgmental stares following her wherever she went. Ethan, on the other hand, was no stranger to public scrutiny. He had dealt with the media for years, but this time it felt different. This wasn't about a business deal or a corporate scandal. This was personal. And the attacks on Lila, the woman he had come to care for deeply, infuriated him. One evening, as they sat together in Ethan's penthouse apartment, Lila scrolled through her phone, her face pale as she read the latest article about them. "I can't do this, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't sign up for this kind of life. People are saying horrible things about me, about us." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Lila, listen to me. None of this matters. These people don't know you. They don't know." "But they're right, aren't they?" she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm just a housekeeper. I don't belong in your world." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "You belong wherever you want to be, and if anyone has a problem with that, they'll have to deal with me." Despite his reassurances, the pressure continued to mount. Ethan's board of directors began to express concerns about the impact the relationship could have on his reputation and, by extension, the company's image. At a tense meeting, one of the senior board members, a sharp-tongued woman named Margaret, didn't hold back. "Hey, then, we're not here to judge your personal life," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But this situation is becoming a distraction. Investors are asking questions. The media is painting a picture that could damage the company's credibility. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his voice carried an edge of defiance. My personal life is just that, personal. It has no bearing on my ability to run this company. All due respect, Margaret countered. Your personal life is now public, and whether you like it or not, it reflects on all of us. Ethan stood, his commanding presence silencing the room. I've built this company from the ground up. I've made this board and our investors billions of dollars. If anyone thinks my relationship with Leela will change that, they're welcome to leave. The room fell silent, and Margaret, though clearly displeased, said nothing more. Ethan left the meeting feeling both frustrated and determined. He knew he couldn't control the media or the opinions of others, but he could control how he responded, and he was determined to stand by Lila, no matter what. A few days later, Ethan made a bold move. He called a press conference, something he rarely did unless it was related to business. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. Lila watched nervously from the sidelines, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan began by addressing the rumors head-on. I'm sure many of you are here because of the recent stories about my personal life, he said, his voice steady and confident. So let me set the record straight. Yes, I am in a relationship with Lila Brooks. Yes, we are expecting twins. And no, I will not apologize for any of it. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Ethan continued, his gaze unwavering. Lila is one of the most intelligent, compassionate, and hard-working people I've ever met. She has brought light into my life in ways I didn't think were possible. And if anyone has a problem with that, I suggest you take a long, hard look at your own life before passing judgment on mine. Lila felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to his words. For the first time since the media storm began, she felt truly seen and protected. Ethan wasn't just defending her, he was claiming her as an equal, as someone who mattered to him deeply. After the press conference, Ethan found Lila backstage. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, I did, he replied, pulling her into his arms. Because you're worth it, and because I'm not going to let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. In that moment, Leela realized that no matter how difficult things became, she wouldn't have to face them alone. Ethan was by her side, and together they could weather any storm. The weeks following Ethan's public declaration were a whirlwind, but slowly the media frenzy began to die down. Ethan's bold stance had silenced many of his critics, and while there were still whispers and judgment from some corners, Lila found herself growing more confident in her place by his side. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not just for herself, but for the family they were about to create. Ethan, true to his word, became more present in her life. He began stepping back from his relentless work schedule, delegating more responsibilities to his team so he could focus on what truly mattered. He accompanied Lila to every doctor's appointment, his excitement growing with each ultrasound as they watched their twins develop. One snowy evening, as they sat together in Ethan's penthouse, Lila looked out at the city lights twinkling below. It's strange, she said softly, her hand resting on her growing belly. I never thought my life would look like this. Ethan, sitting beside her, reached for her hand. Neither did I, he admitted, but I wouldn't change it for anything. Leela turned to him, her eyes searching his. Do you ever regret it? All the changes, the sacrifices? Ethan shook his head, his expression serious. The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing, Lila. A reason to slow down. A reason to care about more than just work. Her heart swelled at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they could make this work. That despite their differences, despite the challenges they had faced, they could build a life together. As the due date approached, Ethan surprised Lila with a trip back to the Everest Grand Resort, the place where their story had begun. He had arranged for them to stay in the same suite where they had first met, but this time it was different. The room had been subtly redesigned, incorporating some of the ideas Lila had shared during their initial conversations about the space. When they arrived, Leela was overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "You remembered," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she took in the lighter furniture, the carefully chosen accents that made the space feel warm and inviting. "Of course I remembered," Ethan said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "This place is where everything changed for me. It's where I met you." They spent the weekend reminiscing, walking through the snow-covered grounds of the resort and talking about their plans for the future. Ethan shared his dream of building a home in the mountains, a place where they could escape the chaos of the city and raise their children in peace. Lila, in turn, spoke about her desire to open her own interior design studio, a dream that Ethan promised to support in any way he could. The twins arrived on a cold, clear night in late February. Lila had gone into labor earlier than expected, and Ethan had driven her to the hospital himself, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a mix of panic and excitement. Hours later, as the first cries of their newborns filled the room, Ethan felt a wave of emotion unlike anything he had ever experienced. He held his son first, marveling at the tiny, perfect features, and then his daughter, whose wide eyes seemed to take in the world with quiet curiosity. Lila, exhausted but glowing with happiness, watched as Ethan cradled their children. "They're beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan looked at her, his own eyes glistening. "They're perfect, just like their mother." In that moment, surrounded by the family they had created, Lila felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. All the struggles, the doubts, the fears, they had all led to this. And it was worth it. A few weeks later, Ethan and Lila returned to the mountains, this time as a family of 4. They moved into a cozy, modern home that Ethan had secretly commissioned during Lila's pregnancy, nestled in the same range of mountains where they had first met. The house was everything Lila had ever dreamed of, bright, open, and filled with love. Ethan had also made good on his promise to support her dreams. With his help, Lila opened her own interior design studio in the nearby town, quickly earning a reputation for her unique ability to create spaces that felt both elegant and welcoming. Life wasn't always easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and the occasional clash of their very different worlds. But through it all, Ethan and Lila remained committed to each other and to the family they had built. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their mountain home, watching the sun set over the peaks, Ethan reached for Lila's hand. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think success was about money, power, and control, but now I know it's about this, about us." Lila smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think we've both found what we were looking for." And as the laughter of their children echoed through the house behind them, they knew that despite the challenges, they had created something truly extraordinary, a life built on love, trust, and the courage to take a chance on each other. A year had passed since the twins were born, and life for Ethan and Lila had settled into a rhythm that neither of them could have imagined before. Their mountain home had become a sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of the outside world and focus on what truly mattered: their family. Lila's interior design studio had taken off faster than she ever expected. Word of her talent spread quickly, and soon she was working on projects for local businesses and even a few high-profile clients who had heard about her through Ethan's connections. But despite her growing success, Lila remained grounded, always making time for her children and for Ethan. Ethan, too, had undergone a transformation. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Carter Financial Group, appointing a trusted colleague to take over as CEO. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to slow down, to enjoy the simple pleasures he had once overlooked, like making breakfast for his family, taking the twins on hikes through the woods, or sitting on the porch with Lila as the sun set over the mountains. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the twins playing on the floor with their toys, Ethan turned to Lila with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think my life was complete. that I had everything I needed. But I didn't even know what I was missing until I met you." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I think we both found something we didn't know we were looking for." Ethan reached for her hand, his gaze steady and full of love. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible, Lila. A family, a home, a reason to be better." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she squeezed his hand. "And you've shown me that it's okay to dream bigger than I ever thought I could. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of giggles as their son toddled over, holding up a stuffed bear. "Daddy!" he exclaimed, his tiny voice full of excitement. Ethan scooped him up, laughing as their daughter crawled over to join them. Lila watched the scene unfold, her heart full. This was her life now, a life she had never dared to dream of, but one that felt more real and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. A few months later, the family returned to the Everest Grand Resort for a special occasion. Ethan had arranged a small, intimate ceremony in the very spot where they had first met. With the snow-capped mountains as their backdrop, Ethan and Lila exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. As they stood together, surrounded by close friends and family, Lila couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. From a chance encounter in a luxury suite to building a life and a family together, their journey had been anything but conventional. But it was theirs, and that made it perfect. As the ceremony ended and Ethan kissed her, Lila felt a sense of peace and joy that she had never known before. She looked into his eyes and saw not just the man she loved, but the partner who had stood by her through every challenge, every doubt, and every triumph. And as the snow began to fall gently around them, Lila knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they would face it together as a family. Thank you so much for watching this heartfelt story. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more inspiring, emotional, and life-changing tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Emma Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing these incredible stories with you. Let us know in the comments what you thought about this story, and feel free to share your own experiences. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, thank you for being a part of the Emma Stories community. See you in the next video.